everyone. I'm Shaddy Saba. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Social Work at USC, and I'll be presenting some work I've carried out along with my advisors and co-authors on pain trajectories and drinking outcomes among veterans during COVID-19. And so just a bit of a background, both pain and problematic drinking are really prevalent among veterans. In fact, pain is the most often endorsed medical condition among veterans, with over half endorsing it. A quarter of military veterans report using alcohol to cope with pain in line with self-medication models. And additionally, stress is likely implicated in all of this, as stress is associated with intensification of pain as well as alcohol use. So that prompted us to think about how are COVID-19 related psychosocial stressors may be associated with pain and drinking in this group. And there was some early work during the pandemic suggesting that veterans were experiencing reductions in or disruptions in pain management, as well as increases in stress, that the veterans were worried that this might be putting us at risk of increased downstream pain. Additionally, there's been a lot of work, pre-pandemic on the effects of things like loneliness and social isolation, and physical pain. Finally, some of the work that we've carried out suggests that there are disparities in drinking outcomes among veterans with things like trauma histories or racial, ethnic, or sexual minority veterans. So the aims of the study, the present study, were one, to examine heterogeneous trajectories of pain among veterans during COVID. And so that means not just looking at a sample as a whole, but seeing, are there subgroups of among the sample with differing or distinct pain trajectories, and then to examine both pre-COVID, so kind of immutable things, trauma history, sociodemographics, et cetera, as well as COVID-related changing stressors, and how do those predict pain? And finally, how is pain related to downstream drinking outcomes? So we have a really cool sample. 1,230 veterans were recruited just prior to the pandemic and were surveyed in February 2020. And so Dr. Peterson, Dr. Davis, and the team thought this was a good opportunity to then follow this group of veterans. And so I'll be presenting on kind of 18 months of data, 5 time points, 4 of which were after COVID-19 or after the beginning of the pandemic. And so I employed a growth mixture modeling approach that involved the following study variables. Pain was assessed at the first 4 time points, pre-COVID, and the next 3, with a numerical rating scale from 0 to 10 of pain intensity over the past week, 0 being no pain, 10 being worst pain ever. That was entered into a model building procedure where we were able to determine the number of pain trajectories or classes. Next, we included the time invariant predictors, so things like age, race, ethnicity, sex, trauma exposure. And then we added the time varying predictors at the kind of middle 3 time points there, which included negative reactions to the pandemic. So that variable included things like relationship trouble, depressed mood, problem sleeping, et cetera, as well as a loneliness variable with a UCLA loneliness scale. And finally, the distal drinking outcomes at the August 2021 time point were AUD severity, or alcohol use disorder severity, with the audit, as well as a measure of severity of drinking consequences. And so here are the results of these are the pain trajectory classes. And again, pain intensity on the y-axis here was on the 0 to 10 rating scale. And you can see kind of the trajectories from the pre-COVID time point through 12 months later. And we have kind of 4 distinct classes here. So one is a chronic pain class that stayed elevated throughout the study period. The largest class is actually this decreasing pain class that began high and then dropped during the study period. So this is immediately after COVID and then on. And then we have kind of a stable mild pain that was always around 3. And then we have an increasing pain group who started low and then experienced increasing levels throughout the study period. In terms of time invariant predictors, especially interesting to think about what differentiates folks that started high and remained high versus folks that started high and dropped. And so if you had ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or you were female sex or minority race or ethnicity, you were relatively likely to be in that chronic pain class versus the decreasing pain class. Whereas now comparing individuals that began relatively low, if you were a younger veteran, you were relatively likely to be in the increasing pain class as opposed to the stable mild pain class. So it looks like if you started low, being younger may be associated with having heightened pain during the pandemic. So things get pretty interesting when we enter the time varying predictor. So here's the results with negative reactions to the pandemic. And you can see for 2 classes, that variable was associated with increases in pain at these 2 post-COVID time points. But this smaller arrow here indicates that that effect decreased for this class over the study period. Whereas when we see loneliness, we see something a little bit different. For these 3 classes, there was no effect for loneliness at that 6-month first post-COVID time point, whereas there was an effect at later time points, suggesting perhaps that loneliness had sort of a cumulative effect, or people experienced kind of like loneliness is getting harder and harder as the pandemic dragged on, kind of thing. Finally, considering the drinking related outcomes and how they relate with the pain classes, we see a similar pattern with both alcohol use disorder severity as well as severity of drinking consequences, where if you were in the chronic pain group or the increasing pain group, you had really relatively high outcomes for both. It's especially surprising because, you know, if we kind of took a look back at the mean levels for AUD in this increasing pain group, and they were kind of down here near the stable mild pain group at the beginning. So they really had a heightening of AUD during the study period. So some quick conclusions and implications. We indeed show high rates of all, you know, of both pain and AUD, alcohol use disorder. In line with prior work, we're highlighting an interplay between both of those, as well as like psychosocial stress, which is important to keep in mind, even in post-COVID context. In line with some of our prior work, we're also showing disparities in terms of minority sex or minority race ethnicity, here specifically with respect to pain. And in terms of future research, it would be interesting to see similar methods applied to non-veteran samples or even a different veteran sample, given this is a pretty sample-specific method. So thanks. All right, thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Erin Vogel, Senior Research Associate. I was wondering about the gender differences in pain trajectories that you found. Do you think that there was a difference in how different genders experienced the pandemic that might have impacted their pain, or what do you think might have caused that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And again, one that, you know, we saw sort of a similar pattern when we looked at alcohol use disorder trajectories in that, you know, females seem to be faring worse. Unfortunately, you know, with respect to like the variables that we included, it's hard to kind of point to a specific reason that we can for sure say. But I personally wonder if, you know, things like childcare or changes in sort of work life balance differentially affected women versus men, and perhaps those kinds of stressors are specifically playing out again because, you know, stress is very highly correlated with pain specifically as well.
Hi, Thank you for a great talk. Adam Leventhal, professor of population and public health sciences. Very impressive. My question for you is, if I understand correctly, this is like a general veteran sample, right? And then there was no like minimal or zero pain class. And
That's
so if I
correct.
correctly, were you surprised that like the least severe class had moderate pain and that you didn't find any minimal or zero pain class? And what do you think the implications of that finding might be? Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. So it's definitely surprising and not surprising in that, veterans are again a group that are very high in pain generally. And then there was the class that started high and then fell to I think it was actually near zero or below one during the pandemic. And so it's interesting that there was a group that even though they started high, they kind of fell. Um, so yeah, definitely uh, begs for I think kind of continued research in terms of like what were the mechanisms and reasons for that.
One last question.
Thank you for your presentation and for focusing on this important group of folks. I have two questions. They're short answers though. One of which is, were uh, were they? How did you classify origin of pain, or did you not classify origin of pain? Like, what was the cause of the pain? And also, if they were self-medicating with alcohol, were they self-medicating with anything else?
Um, so we were unfortunately not able to. Um, we did not ask about origin of pain, and that's something that has come up in multiple analyses I've carried out where it's something I wish that we could answer that question. It would be very interesting to know that. And then um, that's also a great question. I've only applied the specific model with alcohol as an outcome, but I know that we have cannabis use disorder severity as potential outcome, as well as perhaps count variables for some other substances, and I will definitely take that feedback and take a look at those as outcomes as well. Sounds great. Thanks.